1,000 apologies to Joy. I don't remember beating up on her. But I do remember a time when some boys locked us in the same classroom. And rather than be caught in a classroom with a girl, I jumped out the window. But if I hit you, I am very, very sorry. Actually, this is, for me, a celebration of a force of nature, my sister. And many, many years ago, when I was beginning my career in the environmental movement, I got a letter from a man named Walt Taylor in Smithers, BC. And he said, if this is of any use for you, use it. And I've kept this saying up on my wall ever since. And it said, you can accomplish anything you want as long as you don't care who gets credit. And you think about that, you know, I have certainly received far more than my credit, my due, for many things that I've done. But it's people like Aiko who've just been there and given selflessly of their lives, and who really are the driving force of so much of what makes this world such a wonderful place to be in. And I feel that very strongly. There's too much running around for the acknowledgements, and too much failure to recognize what does keep the world going. I thought I hadn't written this down in my notes either, but I thought I might share a small experience since Joy brought back Slocan. My father was bugging me like mad in the last years of his life to take him back to Slocan, to go up to a chain of lakes that we used to go to during the war when we were kept in Slocan. Japanese weren't allowed to fish, but not fishing and eating fish for Japanese is like, you know, what? Not eating grits and hominy, or hominy grits in the southern part of the U.S. It's soul food to us. So we caught a lot of fish illegally. And one of the marvelous places was a chain of 3 lakes, Evans, Cahill, and Beatrice Lake, in an area that is now Valhalla Provincial Park. And I was always saying to my father, yeah, okay, we'll go, but next year, I'm too busy this year. And finally he said, look, I know you're a busy man, I'm going myself. I mean, he was 83 at the time. So I said, okay, and we took him, and we didn't realize at the time he was dying of liver cancer. And he was amazed at how steep the mountain had grown, because of course it had been 50 years earlier when we climbed up that mountain. And I practically carried him up the last 5 miles of that mountain. But when we got to the top, he was triumphant. And I said to my wife at the time, I think Dad may not survive tonight. And I felt what a better place to die. There couldn't be any better place to die than up on that mountain. But he did survive, and it was great. He died 2.5 years later. But to commemorate my dad's that trip, we went back again in June to hike back up that mountain. And it's an 18-kilometer trip, and it's all very steep. So it's quite an achievement to get to the top. But we camped at the top in Beatrice Lake for 3 nights, and it was wonderful. Fishing is still great, and nobody up in the whole valley. We had it all to ourselves. On the 3rd night, I woke up about 4 in the morning, and the valley was filled with voices. And as I became more awake, I tried to figure out what language they were speaking, and I couldn't. The more awake I got, the less distinct the voices came until they finally disappeared. Now, I'm not into that kind of stuff, but when I told my Aboriginal friends, they just said, it's the ancestors telling me your father's okay. You know, whether it was in my head or not, I don't know, but it was very real to me. Anyway, for what it's worth. The great mentor and hero in my life, my greatest supporter and my toughest critic, was my father. And even though he was the eldest son of Japanese immigrants, and of course, as you know, that the first generation came over, their primary focus was to make money. That's what it was all about. For many of them, they didn't want to stay in this country. They wanted to go back to that, you know, this is a primitive civilization. They wanted to go back to civilization in Japan. And thank God, many of them got stuck here because they had kids who were Canadians, like my parents. And Dad never was a total failure in his father's eye. He was the eldest son, and he was expected to do well. Work, make money, buy property, blah, blah, blah. And Dad taught us I'm sure Aiko remembers, that money is something you need in order to survive, but you don't run after money as an end in itself. And we were taught always to feel sorry for people that flaunted their new cars or their clothing and all of that stuff. And I came to understand how wise those lessons were to us. When he was dying in 1994, and he was completely ready to die, he wasn't afraid, he wasn't in pain, and I moved in with him the last month of his life. And every night my wife would come with pictures and slides of trips that we had taken together with my dad. Then my sisters arrived, and each night was a celebration of his life. And I can tell you, it was never about stuff. We never celebrated a closet full of Gucci clothes or a garage with a new sports utility vehicle or a big house. It was all about family and friends and neighbors and things that we did together that truly enriched our lives and made our lives worthwhile. So again, Dad's lesson was very, very powerful. But the greatest gift he gave to me was that love of nature, because he was crazy about gardening, about trees and fishing and camping. My earliest memories in Vancouver are of camping and hiking and fishing in British Columbia, and that bond with nature that has never left me. I always called my dad a mutant. He said, "You're just a mutation, you know, you're not like those other people that are all interested in succeeding in life in a different way." And I'm glad he was a mutation. My mother was a traditional Japanese Canadian. She let my dad, who was very articulate, he loved to talk, and she let him be the center of attention, and everybody thought, "Oh, isn't Carr great?" But my mother held the family together, and I came to understand that as she developed Alzheimer's in the last years of her life, and saw how the family was almost falling apart until my dad stepped in and took over for all the things that she had done without any kind of recognition in her life. And my mother's greatest gift, as I reflect back on my life, was that she never, ever bawled me out for the activities that I carried on as a youth. You know, we were in London, Ontario when I hit puberty. And that was just a terrible, terrible time in my life, as you all know, right? But being Japanese Canadian after the Second World War, you know, you didn't look at white girls and think I had any chance of dating them. So you kind of, there were, I think, 10 girls in, Japanese Canadian girls in London, and 3 of them were my sisters. I didn't get a hell of a lot of choice. But at least we had a swamp near our house, and that swamp was my magic place, and all of my concerns would drift away as I went into that swamp. And I can't tell you the number of times I would come back home soaking wet and covered in mud, but triumphant with a jar of salamander or frog eggs or water beetles, and my mother always just showed total interest and encouraged me and never ever bawled me out for that. I remember when I had this idea I was going to make a lot of money by gathering dewworms at night, selling them to fishermen. So I went out one night and gathered several hundred dewworms, and I put them in a box with some wet paper in it, and stuck them in the fridge. Next morning I wake up and there's my mother sitting on the floor patiently picking the worms that had crawled all through the refrigerator. Not a word, not a word. And that was the great gift that my mother gave to me. Sorry for these reminiscences, but I've been thinking a lot about my childhood and Aiko and my parents over the last few days. But if I could get to the serious part of my discussion, biologists today think that our species, Homo sapiens sapiens,